Welcome to the High Performance Self-Coaching Webinar. I promise this session will give you practical, science-based tools that you can immediately use to take control of your subconscious and perform at your highest level, even in challenging circumstances. In this webinar, we'll dive into the world of how you can consciously direct your subconscious to aid you in achieving your goals, even in high-pressure situations. You'll learn why high-performance self-coaching isn't just about motivation or belief systems, but about scientifically proven methods for rewiring your brain and training your body to work in sync with your vision. This is not about mystical thinking or relying on blind faith. It's practical, grounded in neuroscience, and different from other content you may have seen on this topic. I encourage you to approach today's content with an open mind. Resist the urge to immediately make sense of everything or fit it into what you already know. Think of this experience as peeling back layers of an onion. Every layer reveals something deeper. And I challenge you to ask yourself, if what I'm saying is true, what else has to be true? High-performance self-coaching is about taking charge of automaticity. Most of us operate based on patterns and conditioning that were formed by the age of 7, which we didn't have to work for. It was just a download. And now, those patterns are governing us as much as 95% of our lives. For people my age, my 0 to 7 years, life was vastly different than what it is today. The good news is, those patterns don't have to define you. Advances in neuroscience and fields like neuroplasticity show us that we can rewire our brains, regardless of age. You're not stuck with the brain or the mindset you were born with or have been living with. As I created the 7 fitness areas, 2 factors guided my quest. 1, I wanted something that did not rely on mystical mumbo jumbo. 2, I wanted something that was reliable enough to be a framework that coaches could follow as they work with clients through difficult situations. This method is different from anything you've seen because it's not about pumping yourself up with temporary motivation. You'll learn how to tap into the same powerful principles used by top athletes and elite special forces in the military. People who need to perform at their best, even when the stakes are high and the deck seems stacked against them. Everything we talk about today is grounded in neuroscience and related fields and practical enough for everyday life, especially for business owners and leaders. And as I mentioned, coaches to use as a framework and a roadmap as they work with their own clients. The 7 fitness areas can help you manage your mind, habits, and emotions in high-stress situations, ensuring that you stay at the top of your game regardless of external circumstances. You'll leave the webinar with actionable strategies to maintain personal leadership and agency, enabling you to become the best version of yourself, even on a bad day of a bad week. Now, I invite you to experience this process with an open mind and trust that by the end of this webinar, you'll walk away with powerful new tools for transforming your life. We'll explore simple but effective techniques that can reset your mindset in seconds, allowing you to stay in a growth state even during life's most challenging moments. By mastering these skills, you can design and live a life that you truly love, no matter what's happening around you. So let's get started. As I mentioned, I'm Maurice Maduro, and I have been studying this content for years and wanted to create something that, as I said, is practical. And I think I've accomplished that. So let's get started. Not only did I want something that was reliable, that I could speak to business people about and that they would feel comfortable talking about and that coaches could use, I wanted something that did not require hours of meditation. Nothing against meditation. But the challenge is if a person is really triggered or really in a bad place, it's difficult for them to even think about meditating, let alone do it for any length of time. So I needed something that they can still get there without meditating. Now, I think meditation is important. I think everybody should practice it. But we can get here with 1 minute. That's all you have to do. If you can meditate for 1 minute, that's enough to get started. Then later on, as you meditate more and more, it'll be easier to get into that state. And this is not about living in a specific state. I didn't want a thing that relied on woo-woo. I talk about the woo-woo gaps. There's a spiritual realm. 100% believe there's a spiritual realm. There's also a physical realm. If I twist my ankle, it's going to hurt. Physical, clearly, no question about it. But then there's this other area, this woo-woo area, epigenetics and spontaneous remission and these things that fit in there. And people, now this has been around since the 1800s. The New Thought era, they were talking about this. In fact, you may have heard law of attraction. That was created in the 1800s. It was popularized more recently, but law of attraction goes back to the 1800s. And people would explain it because we didn't have the brain scanning tools at the time to see what areas of the brain were lighting up and to be able to connect the dots. I will tell you that you could lay out everything with law of attraction and these other things, and I can explain 9/10 of it with what I'm talking about today. In other words, it takes the woo-woo gap from here to here. Why? Not because I don't want to have anything spiritual in there. The point is, let's keep the spiritual realm, and let's keep our higher self, and then let's take control of the things that we can take control of. That was the important point. The other thing is, I didn't want people to have this fear of getting hijacked, emotionally hijacked. So this turns out it's one of the reasons why people don't go after their goals. Everybody's has had setbacks, and sometimes those setbacks are so bad that people just don't want to go down that path again. And part of it is because they got triggered, they went into an anxiety spiral, they lost control, somehow they didn't have agency, and they just cannot fathom losing agency when the stakes are that high, so they just play it safe. This may sound familiar, but the point is, we have tools now, and they've always been available, we just didn't know about them. We had the thinking incorrect because, as I said, we didn't have the scanning tools, et cetera, that we do now. And then the last thing I put on there, I didn't want it to be about believing with more emotion. A lot of times people talk about this kind of work, you have to believe harder. You just got to believe. Just say it more often. You got to change your identity. Identity is part of it, and beliefs are part of it. But I would say more in terms of limiting beliefs. We get rid of the limiting beliefs, and a lot of the problems are solved. But we don't start there. So I'll get into it. I mentioned 7 Fitness Series. 7 Fitness Series is my framework. I created this to have a roadmap so people can easily access these tools. Once you learn it, then you can just look at where you are on the 7 fitness areas and focus on that area as a sort of a way to correct or remind. You'll notice it says on the bottom, be, do, have. The idea is that we have to become that person first, and then we can have. Most of society, we operate out of a paradigm of have, do, be. When I have the promotion, then I'll be happy. When I get that car, then I'll be happy. And happiness never comes because it's always relying on some external thing, and that was never the issue. We have to become the person who is the right person for these goals, the vision, the purpose, whatever you have, and then that starts to unfold. No magical, no mystical mumbo jumbo. It's more about becoming the person first rather than going after the have first. And you can see when you go after have first, you can see how that can lead to corruption. It can lead to people falling for these conspiracy theories and tripping over themselves to get to some, easy path. When you go through the be, do, have, you become that person, and like Wayne Dyer said back in the 80s, when you believe it, you'll see it. But it's not about belief. In this case, once you experience it a few times, you'll get it. So I focus on the first 4, mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, when I'm working with a client. And then we'll start introducing the relationship, professional and financial, because I want the goals to be set from that new paradigm, or at least on the way to that new paradigm. I don't want to start with the goals. We have a general idea in mind, but it's really about what we can control. You see, the first 4 are in our control. The last 3 are not. Other people are involved. You want a relationship, there's another person involved with that. You want a particular income in your profession, there's other people involved in that. They have to agree to buy from you. Even in the financial, you may think, well, I'm a trader, so there's nobody else. Well, every buy has a sell, and every sell has a buy. And even if you feel like all you're doing is interacting with the computer, there's still other people involved that make it possible for you to be able to trade the way you trade. My point is, on the right side, there are other people involved, and you can do everything right. You can do everything right and still not get what you want. Just understand that. because it's an important point and it's a good starting place. But once you become that person, it doesn't matter because you know that's just one more way that it didn't work out. So now in these 4 areas, mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional, there's a shift that has to happen in each one. Each area has automatic resistance factors. I call them automatic. And when I say automaticity, I'm referring to the subconscious, that conditioning that started from, or largely created ages 0 to 7. It was updated and tweaked during our teen years. And then I like to say operationalized for our model of the world from 19 to 27 when our prefrontal cortex was formed. And so these become our automatic responses, and some of them are resistance factors. Resistance factors meaning they slow us down. Some people may think, oh, I'm self-sabotaging myself. It's probably resistance factors coming in play. But here's the thing. None of this is really about self-sabotaging. What it is the subconscious's model is to keep you alive long enough to procreate. So most of the challenges that we face are there because of some positive intent, because the subconscious is trying to keep you safe. I must say, this is not about mental health. This is for business people, coaches, high performance. This is about understanding how to take control of that automaticity that seems to have been working against us and now have it working for us. And you can see why it can seem to work against you. If it was created from 0 to 7, that's in the 50s and 60s. Computers weren't even in people's homes at that time. There were no fax machines, no instantaneous information. And yet, that's the model that I'm running on today with all the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It's no wonder people are running around not knowing what to do, chasing this and chasing that. So we're going to get a handle on all that, and it's very easy to do. And then the next one is empowerment catalysts. Now, we also have empowerment catalysts. Some of you have learned them. A lot of athletes will have adopted empowerment catalysts. And essentially an empowerment catalyst handles the resistance factor, because the resistance factor is there because of some habit pattern that at some point was designed to keep you alive. And now the empowerment catalyst is a way to redirect that energy so it's working for you. So when I talk about the automaticity, this is just as automatic as those habits are that stop you, we can get them working to help you. Now, I mentioned a shift is required in each of the areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. Now, this is not what you would think when you hear these words, but it'll make sense to you why I framed it this way. And I put them in a specific order. You saw the be, do, have. All of that worked through. This was a very iterative process to get to where I feel like it works as a roadmap. Once a person goes through this, a coach can very easily work with this with their clients. You can work with this as self-coaching. That's why I call this high-performance self-coaching. So the first shift in the mental area is to discern the difference between the conscious mind, thoughts from the conscious mind, and impulses from the subconscious. Very, very, very different. But people don't realize that. And because they're both energy at their base form, they feel the same. So a person thinks that the impulse from the subconscious is actually a thought from their mind. Doesn't seem like that bad a deal, but it is, because if it's from the subconscious, that means it's from the past, associations largely. I mean, I can create associations about the future using implementation intentions, but generally speaking, habits and the subconscious, that's from the past. That means that if I'm getting an impulse to do something based on this stimulus, that association is based on something that worked once before. Now, that may not have been so bad in an agricultural era when what was happening today is probably the same that's going to be happening 50 years from today, right? That's not true anymore. Think about it. Even the way schools are set up, it's all based on something from long past. So you've got to be able to distinguish the difference. That's the first step. The second thing is to understand the impact of cognitive biases. Cognitive biases actually show up in the physical area as well, but I wanted to start talking about it here because there is an intellectual conversation that goes with the cognitive biases. And once you have that intellectual framework, it makes it easier to deal with them. And then we deal with them again in the physical area. And I have some diagrams that show how this works. Physical area, we're rethinking cognitive processing. The short version there is that more of your cognitive processing is actually physiological. You could say neurobiological as well, especially if you think that 95% of our lives are run by habit. Very little of that is mental cognition. We repeat the same thoughts over and over and over, but the most of the cognitive processing is going on is in the physical area, which changes things, right? Because then it changes how you approach it. The next one is spiritual interaction with the higher self. I already alluded to that some with the closing the woo-woo gap. And then we have the higher self, and I look at the higher self as how we interact with that spiritual realm. Again, taking nothing away from the spiritual area. But if I'm relying on the universe and some woo-woo stuff, then how do I have agency? How do I know that if I get up and I do these things every day that I will have this result? I can't, because I'm hoping that the universe comes through. But when I can collapse that woo-woo gap down to just my actions and the higher self, that's still in my control because I'm deciding what to think in the higher self. And the short version is what we do is we have the higher self where it belongs, the conscious mind where it belongs, and the subconscious where it belongs. Too many people have allowed the subconscious to come above the conscious mind. And as a matter of fact, they listen and think in terms of the subconscious as the higher self. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake because when you start trying to change habits, you're literally asking the programmer to change the program. You're like asking the fox to check the lock on the hen house. You're not going to get anywhere. That's why we get into these circular loops. But when you have the higher self can program the programmer. And the conscious mind can program the programmer. And you'll get to the point where habit change literally becomes as easy as becoming aware that that habit no longer serves me. Now, I'm not saying across the board. Some habits are deeply ingrained, and I may get into it today talking about myelin. When neurons get wrapped with myelin, they fire faster, stronger, with more accuracy, and they're much harder to disrupt. So there are going to be some deep-seated habits that take a little bit more work. But for those easy habits that don't have high stakes, just the awareness that it no longer serves you can be enough to break the habit. And that's powerful. That's very, very powerful. And then the last one is the emotional, maintaining a growth mindset. A lot of people talk about, mindset is everything. And they think that they have a growth mindset. But people don't realize you can have a growth mindset in the first half of the hour and a fixed mindset in the second half of the hour just because something happened. You can have a growth mindset in the category, but then subparts of that category, you have a fixed mindset. You can go into a fixed mindset very, very easily. And if you're not aware, you can stay in that fixed mindset. I call it unresourceful. If you're in an unresourceful state, it's very hard to make progress. And the longer you stay in an unresourceful state, guess what? It becomes more and more unresourceful. One, you're not being resourceful, but the second thing is the way the neurons work, you're just, leaning in more and more and more, and next thing you know, you're in a spiral on the worst case. Now, I mentioned discerning the difference between conscious and subconscious, and I've talked about the discerning the difference. Fast and slow thinking is the easiest way to do it initially. Now, later on, you'll actually be able to discern the difference, but fast and slow thinking is the quick way to do it. Why? Conscious mind processes at 50 bits per second and has a reaction time of about a half a second, 500 milliseconds, a half a second. The subconscious, on the other hand, which, as I said, is associations. Remember, the subconscious is where your habits lie. I don't think anybody's going to have a problem with me saying that. If habits are really associations, where did those associations come from? They came from the past. So your habits are all based on the past. So if I'm acting out of a habit, that's probably not serving me today, especially if I'm moving above the line. Now, if I'm in the same job I was in 20 years ago and I'm not planning on doing anything different, that's all I want to do is just keep working this thing, widgets in, widgets out, I'm probably okay running by habit. But if I'm in business and I'm dealing with a VUCA environment, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and I'm making moves, I'm always in a new landscape. And so my habits and associations are probably not going to serve me as well as they did when they were first formed. So going on, then that's the subconscious. So going on, the subconscious processes at 11 million bits per second. It has a reaction time of 250 milliseconds or a quarter of a second. So just look at that. The quarter of a second to a half a second, no big surprise there. But the 11 million bits per second? So by the time the conscious mind comes online with its paltry, slow 50 bits per second, the subconscious has already processed somewhere around, or the potential to process around 3 million bits. One way I describe it is if you've ever fallen off of something and you had your life flash before your eyes, maybe some people experience it in an accident or falling off a bicycle or whatever. It's like their life flashes before their eyes. The way I describe that is the subconscious is running through the database trying to figure out how do we get out of this pickle? How do I land so I don't get hurt. You can see how fast it goes, right? That's that subconscious. That's the neurons firing and wiring together. By looking at just that slide, 11 million bits per second and 2.25 of a second, if I'm having an impulse, people have these little ticks on their face, tells, people play poker, they're watching people's faces. That's a subconscious. And I know with the emotional intelligence, 700 muscles, involuntary muscles in the face. Involuntary, so we don't even control them. They just happen, and they're happening because of these associations. You change the associations, you change the how the muscles fire. There were two neuroscientists, I think they were neuroscientists, and they were studying to see if they could get people to actually control and take control over some of those involuntary muscles. And I think to a degree they were able to. It makes the point of how difficult it is, the amount of time that they put into it. Fast and slow. Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, in 2012, and he didn't quite say this in the book, but he got very close to this line of thinking, that the fast thinking is the subconscious, and it's not thinking. That's the key. It's not thinking, it's associations. And this is why it's important to discern the difference, because why would you give associations from 20, 30, 40 years ago the same credibility as you give your thoughts that come from the mind? The mind is powerful. It can relate the unrelated. It can imagine into the field of infinite possibility. The subconscious can only do habits and associations. It can connect very, very fast, but it's sort of like ChatGPT. You can ask it a question and have it explain something to you, and all of this related stuff, it won't even bring up. But if you bring up the related stuff, and it gives you more information about that related stuff. It's the same way with the subconscious. It focuses on what neurons are firing and wiring, and that part of the work is to be able to take charge of that with the conscious mind. Fast and slow thinking, we talked about it. So this is sort of a recap. And this is a typical stimulus response, how people think of it. The stimulus happens, 1/4 of a second, subconscious comes online, and it's doing its firing thing, it's looking. To put this in perspective, cats have a reaction time of somewhere around 50 to 80 milliseconds. That's why they're so fast. You see a cat with a snake, these videos, and a snake moves and the cat's gone. It jumps so fast. Dogs have a reaction time of about 150 milliseconds. If you see the videos of cats and dogs fighting, you can see the cat clearly has the faster reaction time. What's interesting is athletes, especially the ones who do reaction drill training, like Formula One drivers who have to do the, catching the balls and making quick decisions to train for the driving, they can get their reaction time down to about 150 milliseconds. You see it in running backs in football, and you see it in basketball. Some of these people have these instantaneous reaction times, and they call it muscle memory. And it's not really muscle memory, it's nervous system memory, because the muscle is not remembering. It's the nervous system, wrapped in myelin, which I mentioned earlier. You wrap it in myelin, it fires faster and with more accuracy. That's your muscle memory, but it's nervous system memory. And I make that distinction because it works on what you say, it works on what you think. So you can apply the same kind of muscle memory to every area of your life using implementation intentions. You can do it using visualization. You can do it using deep practice. The last part here, you see I have reaction equals response. See, I don't think of this as stimulus response. I think of it as stimulus reaction response. Stimulus reaction response. And that response, you're deciding, and then you act. Maybe you speak, and maybe you go into fight or flight. Maybe you go into freeze or withdraw. Whatever that reaction is, because too many people think that the subconscious reaction is a thought from the mind, they then justify it and double down on it, and the reaction equals the response. We don't want that. What we want is to separate the reaction and the response. But we also have to understand the pre-stimulus. Now, in this case, the pre-stimulus, I'm mainly talking about priming, because cognitive biases would come after the stimulus or right around the same time. But pre-stimulus, priming could be days in advance. I could have somebody primed days in advance for something, right? I mean, you mentioned that there's going to be a snowstorm and people go out and buy things. They do it the same thing, even though they're living in an area where it snows 3 inches and it melts, like Virginia. When I lived in Virginia, the same thing happened. It melts by the middle of the day, but people still have that behavior because it's conditioned. When I first moved to California, it was very interesting. 50 degrees was in October was a cold day. And it's almost like on October 1st, and I'm not exaggerating. I came from Chicago. I moved there from Chicago, right? So think about that. I'm not exaggerating. I would see people with mittens and scarves and knit hats. It's like October 1st came and it's mittens, scarves, and a knit hat because now it's wintertime. They have no clue. You have no idea how cold it can be living in New York, skiing in Canada. Anyway, another story. So we have this priming, cognitive biases, social influence. I want to mention this because a lot of our cognitive processing is actually physiological. Even the pre-stimulus is somewhat physiological. The other thing I'll mention, this is just quick, but you may want to just take a quick shot of this screen. Self-determination theory is huge, especially if you're a leader or a coach. This solves a lot of problems. If you're a leader and you want to build high-performing organizations, I would definitely look at self-determination theory, because self-determination theory gets to these three human needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And when those are present in what the person is doing, it generates intrinsic motivation. Now, people say intrinsic motivation is cool. Yeah, it comes from internally, from inside. It's only half the story, not even half the story. What's so important about intrinsic motivation is that it's enjoyment for the activity itself. And there's a way as a leader that you can actually get people to enjoy the activity, because you're using the dopamine and the serotonin and the normal habit pattern processes to actually make the linkages so that the work that they're doing is providing that same intrinsic that same joy that they would get. And in fact, intrinsic motivation is more powerful than the external incentives that you can use. Because when you have monetary incentives, and anybody in leadership knows this, people always leave money on the table. Salespeople on commission always leave money on the table. They might be having these spurts where they knock the cover off the ball, but generally speaking, people leave money on the table. But when you go after intrinsic motivation, this is where that high performance comes from, because you're not dealing with it you're not having to tweak the thing all the time. Now, the physical, some cognitive processing is physiological. Actually, I should say more than half, 100 billion neurons. This is the game changer. If you look at a list of what the subconscious does, and you take another list and you look at what neurons do, you'll recognize that they're the same thing. So obviously we don't need two systems. That piece alone will tell you that the subconscious is not a mind, it's a network of neurons, 100 billion neurons. And think about that number. If you moved 1,000 neurons every day, it would take you 273,000 years to move 100 billion neurons. 86 billion neurons or so are in the brain, another 14 billion or so throughout the body. That's how we get to the 100 billion. 20 billion are in the prefrontal cortex. So when I mentioned that the prefrontal cortex forms from age 19 to 27 or so, that's 20 billion neurons that are forming around to, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but to say it in layman terms, it sort of operationalizes the person's life so that they have a model of the world. And then that's how they play out their life. So running 95% by habit, it made perfect sense as a hunter-gatherer, because you got along with the tribe. You knew how to hunt. You knew what berries to eat. You weren't changing jobs and changing locations and moving halfway around the world. You were staying right there with that tribe. That model worked. It's different today. So we're learning, and unfortunately, we're too often under stress because the subconscious is so fast, as I was mentioning. That reaction is happening so quick, and then our response matches the reaction. And because we think it was the mind and a real thought, we double down on it and justify it and keep chasing that rabbit hole. And meanwhile, we're just creating havoc and toxicity. Impulses through the neurons are similar to thoughts, and those impulses have the same signature as they're both energy. And this is why it's easy to be fooled. But once you start discerning the difference, you'll know. First, you'll learn by speed, but then you'll learn by the quality and the nature of it. And then you'll start to ask yourself different questions to tap into the conscious thinking, and you do other things like pausing. The big thing to say on this slide is what you want to start doing is making just a data point. I already talked about the reaction versus the response. That reaction, what you want to do is just a data point. You're going to have to actually do something with the conscious mind to decide what the response really should be. Slow thinking is the conscious mind working. As I mentioned, the objective is to learn the difference and have them work together. That's when you start putting automaticity to work for you. So I already talked about the pre-stimulus, and I said a lot of that's physical. When you look down here, a lot of that is physiological. Cognitive biases, I would say, are largely physiological because there are habits, and where do habits live? They live in the neurons. Why do I say neurons are physiological and not mental? Because if a person dies, their brain and the nervous system are still there on the ground on Earth. The mind, the impulses, what's going through there, the spirit, the soul, that's all gone. And so if you think about mind, body, spirit, well, the mind is different than the body. The spirit is different than the body, but in the body is the brain and the nervous system and the neurons. Now, the impulses going through there is not physical. That's the electrical impulses. But the habits and the neurons and the myelin and the synapses, that's all physical. I added the cognitive biases here. So cognitive biases is a heuristic, that shortcut. And the one I like to use is confirmation bias. And I think this is the one that gets people caught up in these conspiracy theories. There's actually a newsletter that did this. What it would do is it would send out 4 different versions of stock recommendations. And then the group that got the recommendation that was right, they would send that group, split them up, and they would send out 4 cohorts, so to speak. And then the group that got the correct prediction, they would send out another cohort. And so that's 3 times, right, that this group saw a newsletter from this company, and each time the prediction was true. Confirmation bias says that if I hear 3 things that are undeniably true from a source, that I automatically give credibility to that source and believe the 4th thing automatically. What's worse is it takes 11 iterations of counter information for me to stop believing them. Now you can see why it's so easy for a person to fall into a conspiracy theory, because you tell them 3 things that are undeniably true, and then they start believing, and from 4th to 11, it's just automatic. And all you have to do is keep touching it. Right? I said it takes 11 iterations to reverse their thinking, but if you keep touching it, it's like in psychology class, that duck that tapped the little disc, and sometimes it got food and sometimes it didn't. It would tap that disc for the rest of its life because it was random, but it happened often enough. So as long as that source comes with the true information, it doesn't matter if they're batting 1 in 10, right? It's still, well, yeah, but they were right. And so cognitive biases, I went deep down this path of looking at cognitive biases, thinking it was going to be part of the 7 Fitness series, but what I went was upstream, and rather than deal with all the different kinds of cognitive biases, we have a strategy that just takes them out of play, which was more useful. You have the pre-stimulus, the stimulus, the cognitive bias, and for example, the book Influenced by Robert Cialdini, he talks about this like social proof and consistency, commitment, scarcity, authority. All of those are examples of cognitive biases, but there's a 3 dozen that I came up with that could actually impact a person's performance when they're on this high performance path. And then reframing, you could just take a shot of that screen, because I'm not going to get into that here, but reframing is something that you do after the stimulus, once the reaction and the response happens. But this is late for me, but it's still useful, and it's something that I use in the beginning sometimes with the client if I've got to get them moving along, because you have to have some space, and to create space I can use reframing. So there's 2 kinds. There's context reframing and there's meaning reframing. You can take a shot of that one. And then meaning reframe, another example. And I call it in the physical area because we're using our senses, we're talking, we're visualizing, we're imagining it differently. You could argue it's mental, but I'd like to have it in the physical area because what you're doing is tapping into a whole different set of associations. By changing my frame from here to there, I'm tapping into different associations, and what was scary over here now seems like, oh, it's just okay because I reframed it. And here we have cognitive processing. To neutralize an adverse pre-stimulus, physically shift your physical attention. Think 5 senses. What I'm saying there is you can literally shift your attention. You can see the physical part of it. If you ever watch athletes or somebody who's going through a really tough situation, they know to just look and focus on what they have to do, and they block out everything else. Shifting your attention is powerful. You walk into a room and you don't like what you're seeing, you can shift your attention. Somebody's talking to you and saying something that you don't like. Instead of getting triggered, you can shift your attention to something else. You don't want to suppress that. You can shift your attention. So many different ways to think about it. But if you think the 5 senses, You can hear, you can start saying words in your mind, you can see a different picture. That's how we stop people from saying ums, for example, is we use visual, and we just change the frame really quickly to change that association. So rather than say they pause. And eventually they don't need to pause. But if they do have to pause, it's there. And then you have touch. You can set anchors for yourself. So there's a lot of things we can do with the physical cognitive processing part. And then there's the spiritual awareness by your higher self. So I like to talk about the spiritual area, the higher self area, as awareness. You are aware that we're having a conversation about awareness. You are aware that you're aware. But think about it this way. You may have been on a diet, or maybe you were going to go work out or something, and you said you're going to leave to go to the gym at 7 o'clock, and now it's 7:05 and you haven't left, and you're aware that you haven't left, and then you're aware that you're still there, and you're aware that you're aware, and you're aware that you're still there, and you're not acting. See, awareness is one of the first lines of defense to start taking charge of our lives again. And it's not just that awareness is going to make you do the thing. It's that you understand that there's a subconscious and a conscious. And if you want to go to the gym and you're not going to the gym and you have a reason, is that reason a conscious reason, or is it a habit pattern that has you scrolling on social media? So that's the beginning of this. But awareness is a huge start. And the reason I talk about it like this, awareness of awareness, is because the consciousness is undefinable, and consciousness is a big part of the present moment. The mind is undefinable. Now, you'll see some people say that the mind is the brain at work. Your neuroscientists, the people who understand quantum physics, will say they disagree with that. The mind is not the brain at work. The brain at work is the subconscious. That's the neurons firing and wiring. So there's a lot of misinformation out there. If you started with Newtonian physics and you try to explain all this, you're going to have some gaps. If you explain it from a quantum physics perspective, it gets a little bit easier. And then the spiritual area, more collapsing the woo-woo gap. We talked about that, and we're going to collapse the woo-woo gap through understanding what's going on, honoring that powerful present moment. The powerful present moment, as you see, they have mindfulness. It's that consciousness, which is the higher self. It's thought, making sure the thought is pure, and then the mind being able to work freely. Thought and mind, no anxiety about the future, no regrets from the past. You want to have that pure present moment. And when I was talking about meditating for 1 minute, when you can get into 1 minute moments of just that pure mind, pure consciousness, and pure thought, that's the start of it. You're quieting the subconscious. I put infinite possibilities on here because when you do start to step into this realm, and I have a slide coming up where I talk about above the line, but this infinite possibilities it opens up to you. When you're running your life by habit, you can't access the infinite possibilities because the unfamiliar is a threat to the unconscious. And when it has threats, you run into fight or flight, a stress response, and it makes it more difficult to go into that. And I have used the higher self to train your subconscious and put the automaticity of the subconscious to work for you. Now here's a graphic of what I was talking about. So when you're here, running along 95% by habit, the subconscious is happy. Everything's associations. It's the past is equal to the future. It's like being in the matrix. I don't have to think. I just operate. And then what happens when you try to go up here, that field of infinite possibility, there's so much unknown and unfamiliar, you get this cognitive dissonance. And the problem with cognitive dissonance is it can feel like anxiety. Anxiety and excitement can feel the same. And so as you step above this line into this area, this cognitive dissonance, it's the unfamiliar, and then you're doing something you're not supposed to be able to do. You get this excitement and this unfamiliarity, and this cognitive dissonance can kick people back. This is why it's so hard to cross the line. Joe Dispenza talks about it as crossing the river. I look at it the same way. I have a graphic of a barrier that I use. So then there's another, here's, I said, the typical stimulus response. We want to talk about retraining the subconscious to scan for positive 70-30 instead of scanning for the negative 70-30. Because the subconscious was designed or is designed to keep us alive long enough to procreate, you can see why it would be scanning for the negative so often. I'm not going to go through this. This is an example of empowerment catalysts. I have dozens of them. Like I said, I have roughly a dozen or so resistance factors for each of the 4 areas. So there's a good 50 or so empowerment catalysts that go with those resistance factors. But here's a good start. You take this list, and these are some things you can do. Box breathing, reframing, we talked about, just taking a self-compassion break, visualizing success, some obvious things, but this is a start. And then we're going to retrain the subconscious with the positivity drill. The positivity drill is literally retraining your subconscious. It takes about 6 weeks, and you train that the same way you would train an animal. You just repetition and keep moving in that direction, repetition. And I recommend doing it 3 times a day. It takes about a minute or 2. You're going to do the positivity exercise. And by putting this positivity exercise in between the stimulus and the reaction, so this is in that world where the cognitive biases live, right? By scanning for the positive, you're starting to take control, and it influences what happens next. Now, remember, I mentioned this is a quarter of a second. And then we have a half second, another quarter second before the conscious mind comes online. By changing the scan for positive, you're going to be filtering through less negative stuff. And you're still going to look at that as a data point because it's associations from the past. And then you've got a quarter of a second for the conscious mind to come on. By the second quarter of a second, or this would be the third, so 3/4 of a second in, you can have made an assessment for a more resourceful response. So this is down here. A quarter of a second, you get the subconscious reaction. Another 200 or so milliseconds, you're going to get the conscious mind starting to come online. You make your assessment, 300 milliseconds, you've got some semblance of and you'll train your subconscious to give you the information fast enough so you can make that quick assessment. But you're not always going to do it in a half second. Sometimes you're going to decide, you know what, it's big enough, I'm going to delay it. So I say delay it. You're going to dump it. It's not important. I'm going to get rid of it, not even think about it. I'm going to delegate it. Yes, it's important, but I'm going to assign it to somebody else or do it. So those are 4 choices that you can make in this assessment. Delay it, dump it, delegate it, do it. And that way you go into your final one with a little more resourcefulness. So I mentioned the positivity exercise, essentially what it becomes. This is not positive mental attitude. It's not reframing. It's literally retraining your unconscious. You are going to teach your subconscious that when it thinks about a negative experience from the past, you automatically flip it to the greater positive context. So in this example, the flat tire is the negative experience, but the positive context is I have a car. And at one point, having a car was a goal, a major important goal. So yes, I have a flat, but it's because I have a car, because I met my goal. And that training, that quick, that literally teaches your subconscious, because remember, it's processing 11 million bits per second. It's quickly teaching your subconscious that it saw that threat, but look at the positive context. And as long as there's a positive context, then it's feeding through this sequence neutral or more positive impulses rather than impulses of threat. So again, it's not a positive mental attitude. It's not about reframing. It's not about willpower. It's not about suppression. You're training your subconscious the same way you would train an animal, just by repetition, doing it the way you want it to do it. You're doing it. That's why I said 6 weeks, 3 times a day. Do it with meals, 1 or 2 times per event. So, breakfast, you do it. Actually, I say 2 or 3 times. It takes you 30 seconds, 10 seconds to think of the negative experience, 2 seconds to flash on to the new one, and then bask in it for another 20 seconds. That's you can do 3 of those in a minute and a half. So that's it. The summary. Step 1, think of a bad experience. Step 2, quickly switch to the larger positive context. Step 3, let the bad experience fade into the presence of the larger positive context. This works. And then about a week and a half in, you'll start seeing changes, and then start doing it more intentionally as life throws you curves. Just start adopting it into your life, but keep doing the exercise for this 6 weeks. Here's the summary. You can take a shot of that screen. This is powerful. You do this and your triggering, it will drop. You will reduce your triggering. You'll reduce your stress responses. You'll reduce your fight or flight, and you'll be able to stay focused in attention, placing your attention on what's really important. So now we have this new stimulus response cycle. It's the positivity exercise is now in there, and that handles the cognitive biases. So just by doing that, you're taking the cognitive biases largely out of play, because the heuristic is no longer there to keep you alive and dealing with threats. And then we have the reaction. I notice, you see, I have positive expectancy, benefits, gratitude, abundance, all is well. Isn't that a nice reaction to have? And now you're making an assessment with the thing in a much more resourceful state. And then the last one is emotions, emotional modulation. So sometimes you still will get triggered, right? You can still get triggered and end up over here. So we've got this potential for hijacking. And what we're going to do is, when that happens, and it should be very rare because of all these other steps we put in place. But remember, emotions you shouldn't be dwelling on them, should not be harboring. Don't let them turn into feelings. Don't make them turn into feelings by dwelling on it. The emotion should be passing through in 90 seconds. Now, you probably have a lot of emotions that have become feelings. They're lodged in your network of neurons. So it's going to take some time to work those out. It's fairly simple. You just have to think about the emotion, let it build up, locate it. Where is it in my body? Label it. And the reason why we want to label it to one of these 8 emotions is because this list represents all of the negative emotions. So all your negative emotions can be distilled down to this list. And it's very different to have the label of sadness or shame or embarrassment or disappointment or frustration rather than anxiety, right? If it's all just anxiety, which is what can happen when you have what seems like an infinite amount of negative emotions, then everything is just bad. But when you label it, helplessness, well, I can choose not to be so helpless. I can choose not to be timid in this situation. I can choose to be assertive. And then it's manageable because it's not somebody doing something to you. It's you choosing to be a certain way. That could be enough to get you out of the funk. But anyway, so we locate it, we label it with one of these, and then you learn from it. So LLL, locate it, label it, learn from it. And I talk about surfing the emotion, that 90 seconds. This came, by the way, from Joan Rosenberg, her book, 90 Seconds to a Life You Love. It's not all from her, but she's the one who talks about these 8 emotions. And she has what's called the Rosenberg Reset. It's similar to what I just described. It's a great book to read, especially if you experience a lot of anxiety and you're having trouble with being triggered, because essentially what it does is it takes that whole triggering experience and neutralizes it. This is not suppressing. You do not want to suppress the emotion. If you suppress the negative emotion, you're also limiting the amount of joy that you can feel. So you don't want to suppress it. Besides that, by suppressing it, you're just adding more and more energy onto that emotion. You're just adding more and more negative energy to it, which makes it seem to grow. And then we have this chart again. So I told you I had another graph.